Imagine yourself seated at an old wooden table in the quiet stillness of an ancient library. The warm, golden glow of an oil lamp spills across thick, time-worn pages, while the faint scent of aged paper and ink lingers in the air. Before you rests a weathered copy of the Bible, its pages yellowed with age. Neat lines of Hebrew letters run across the text, but on the outer margin of one page, amid stains left by centuries, there is a small, almost whispered note. Lilith was here. And then, nothing. No explanation, no story, just absence. In the main text, her name does not exist, yet her name, Lilith, still echoes in whispered legends and half-forgotten paintings hidden in the dim corners of churches, in protective amulets hung above doorways. From ancient Sumerian inscriptions pressed into clay, to medieval folk tales, to modern debates over freedom and autonomy, Lilith has moved through thousands of years of history, sometimes as a cursed specter, sometimes as a symbol of defiance. This is not merely the story of a figure erased from the page. It is the journey of a presence that never truly vanished, a persistent trace of the woman who would not bow. From the dawn of civilization to the digital age, let us walk slowly through the layers of time to find Lilith, not only in the written word, but in the way history, religion, and culture have continually rewritten her. If you want, I can also make this even more cinematic in tone, so it feels like the opening narration of a history documentary. That would make it flow like your Golem script style. Would you like me to do that? Imagine yourself in a quiet, lamp-lit library on a winter evening. The air is cool, still, and faintly scented with dust and aged parchment. Your fingers brush across the rough grain of a wooden table as you lean closer to an open book. Not just any book, but a centuries-old Hebrew Bible. The pages, thick and yellowed, have softened with time, curling slightly at the edges. The ink of the main text, dark and deliberate, marches in steady lines across the page. And then, in the margin, almost hidden among the age spots and faint smudges, you notice it. A small line of cramped handwriting, slanted as though it were whispered onto the page. The words in Hebrew read, "Lilith is here." You look for her in the main text, but she isn't there. Her name appears only in that faint note, as if she exists in the edges of the story, not in its heart. She is a shadow lingering outside the sanctioned lines. It is here, in this absence, that the story begins. The woman called Lilith has been many things across the millennia: a night spirit, feared in the deserts of ancient Mesopotamia, a dangerous beauty in medieval folklore, a quiet ember in whispered lullabies, and more recently, a rallying figure in movements for independence and equality. Her form shifts across centuries and cultures, yet always carries the trace of defiance, the image of the woman who would not bow. More than 4,000 years ago, her earliest echoes appeared in Sumerian and Akkadian tablets. These were lands of sun-baked clay, bustling temple courtyards, and the rustle of palm fronds in the hot wind. Lilith's name, or something close to it, was spoken in the breath of night spirits. Female figures said to wander the darkness, bringing unease to sleepers. They were neither fully gods nor fully human, dwelling in a liminal place that both fascinated and frightened the people who imagined them. Those first inscriptions were not full stories, but fragments, a name, an epithet, a warning. Like footprints in sand, they told us someone had passed here, but left the direction unknown. From these fragments, Lilith emerges not yet as a woman, but as a presence, one that seemed to resist the roles laid out by myth and law alike. And it is from these shadows of the world's first cities that she begins her journey, a journey that will lead her into one of the most famous gardens in human storytelling. Picture the landscape where her earliest name was spoken, the cradle of civilization, stretching between the slow, winding courses of the Tigris and Euphrates. The air here could shift from shimmering heat to cool desert winds within a single night. In those winds, people imagined unseen presences moving, spirits that brushed past tent flaps or lingered just beyond the flicker of an oil lamp. Among the Sumerians, she may have been called Lilith, a night-dwelling figure associated with the wild, untamed places beyond the city walls. In Akkadian incantations, similar beings were described as dangerous to children and expectant mothers, not with the cruelty of a monster, but with the restless hunger of something unbound by human laws. Clay tablets, pressed with wedge-shaped cuneiform, sometimes carried her name alongside the names of other spirits to be warded away. In these spells, the speaker might call upon the protection of gods, invoking sacred symbols and spoken charms to keep such beings at bay. Yet the presence of Lilith in these early texts is never straightforward. She is not a demon in the way later centuries would imagine. More often, she is a figure who defies boundaries, one who belongs neither to the hearth nor to the orderly heavens, but to the thresholds in between. Imagine a small Sumerian household on a silent night. Outside, the walls are made of baked mud brick, warm to the touch even after sunset. Inside, the dim light of a clay lamp dances across the patterned reed mats. An infant sleeps, swaddled, while the parents murmur quiet prayers. In their mind's eye, they picture the spirit, hair loose, eyes catching the faint light, and they speak her name only as part of a protective spell. The fear is real, but so is the respect. This being, after all, is ancient, older than the city itself. From these desert winds and riverbank villages, her legend would begin to travel. Across languages and religions, she would take on new shapes, but always carry the memory of this first form, the woman of the margins, the night visitor, the figure whose power was recognized even by those who feared her. From here, she will step into a new role, not merely a spirit, but a woman of flesh and breath, in a garden said to be the birthplace of humanity itself. In these later writings, Lilith is not simply a shadow on the edge of campfires. She stands in the very heart of the creation story. In one telling, she is formed at the same moment as Adam, from the same substance, not from a rib, not after the fact, but side by side, equal in the eyes of the Creator. The garden in these stories is not just a place of peace and plenty. It is a space where questions of power and identity first take root. Imagine the soft light of Eden's dawn filtering through leaves heavy with fruit, the air alive with the scent of water and earth. Two figures walk together, neither above nor below the other, each new to the feel of their own hands, their own voice. But equality in these tales does not remain unchallenged. Conflict arises not over food or shelter. There is no scarcity here, but over something subtler and far more enduring, the question of who decides, who leads, and who follows. Lilith, as these writings describe, will not take a place beneath Adam, neither in body nor in spirit. She speaks plainly, and in that refusal, she marks herself as different from what the story will later expect of a woman. Some scholars note that this part of the tale, her equality, her dispute with Adam, is not present in the original text of Genesis. they suggest it may have been added centuries later, shaped by the concerns and cultural debates of the writers who preserved it. Whether ancient or later invention, the scene leaves a clear impression. Lilith's first act in the Eden story is to define herself on her own terms. And in the logic of myth, that is the first step toward her transformation, from companion to threat. In this telling, Adam and Lilith are not bound by hierarchy at the moment of their creation. They are shaped from the same earth, animated by the same breath, and placed together in a garden without borders. This shared origin should, in theory, mean a shared place in the order of things. But in the rhythm of life in Eden, a quiet tension begins to grow. Lilith is not content to simply mirror Adam's will. And Adam, accustomed to being the measure of all things in the story, does not yield his sense of primacy. Their dispute is not over possession. For in Eden, nothing is owned, but over position. Each believes themselves the equal of the other, and each resists the idea of yielding. The details differ among sources. In some versions, Lilith voices her belief directly. We are made from the same earth. We are the same. In others, her resistance is shown not through words, but through the way she acts, choosing her own path through the garden, answering Adam's requests with silence or with questions. In the oldest strata of Scripture, this chapter of the story does not exist. The Genesis text makes no mention of a woman before Eve, and Adam's solitude is described as unbroken until the rib is taken. The Lilith episode, scholars tell us, may have been woven into the fabric of Jewish storytelling many centuries later, perhaps as a way of explaining difficult verses, or perhaps as a commentary on gender and authority. But whatever its origin, the image endures. A first woman who stands as an equal, refuses to bow, and in doing so, breaks the harmony of Eden. This moment, whether ancient truth or later invention, becomes the hinge on which her fate turns. From here, the myth begins its slow shift, transforming Lilith from a partner to a figure of danger, a presence to be guarded against rather than embraced. As the centuries turn and the medieval world takes shape, the figure of Lilith drifts farther from the quiet gardens of Eden. In the minds of scribes and storytellers, she becomes less a woman and more a specter, a being of the night, one who moves in the spaces between lamp and doorway. The Hebrew and Aramaic texts of the Middle Ages often call her the mother of demons, a title that seals her place among the terrors that haunt the hours after sunset. In folk tales, she roams at night, seeking newborn children and the mothers who cradle them, her presence blamed for fevers, stillness, or sudden illness that arrive without warning. She becomes the embodiment of a collective fear, that life's most fragile beginnings can be stolen away in silence. In Jewish communities from Persia to Spain, her name is spoken in lowered tones, more often implied than uttered. Rabbis include her in lists of spirits to be warded off. Poets wrap her image in metaphor, describing the moonless hours as her favored dwelling. The transformation is not simply theological. In an era when childbirth was perilous and infant mortality common, the figure of Lilith offers a way to give shape to grief and uncertainty. She is at once the cause and the explanation, the unseen hand behind tragedies that cannot otherwise be understood. Her role now is no longer to share Eden as an equal. It is to dwell outside the walls, beyond the lamps, in a world where human light and divine order give way to shadow. And in that shadow, her image will take on new layers, becoming bound to charms, amulets, and whispered rites meant to keep her at bay. In the towns and villages of medieval Europe and the Middle East, belief in Lilith's presence was not confined to whispered stories. It was woven into the fabric of everyday life. Families crafted ways to keep her at a distance, rituals that blended scripture, folk magic, and the deep human need for reassurance. One of the most enduring protections was the kamea, or protective amulet. These were often thin sheets of parchment or metal, inscribed with sacred names and verses. Many bore intricate diagrams, circles, stars, or interlocking lines, symbols meant to confuse or repel wandering spirits. In the margins, small illustrations sometimes showed Lilith herself, bound or driven away by angels. Yet, among the surviving amulets found in old collections, there is a curious discovery. Some bear not the language of banishment, but of accord. Phrases appear that read like quiet agreements, promises that the wearer will be spared so long as certain conditions are met. It is as if these were not weapons of spiritual battle, but peace treaties, negotiated between the living and the figure they feared. These objects were placed above the cradle, hung near the door, or even worn discreetly under clothing. The parchment might be scented faintly with the oils or incense of the home. The ink faded to a warm brown with age. To touch one was to feel a connection to generations who had turned their fears into tangible things. Small, protective anchors against an unseen world. These practices did more than guard against a specific spirit. They created a sense of control in a time when illness, loss, and the hazards of the night were constant companions. And through them, Lilith's image spread beyond the pages of sacred text, seeping into the symbols, art, and religious imagination of the age. A path that would lead her into the next chapter of her long and shifting story. As the centuries passed, the figure of Lilith drifted beyond the boundaries of Jewish tradition, reshaped and renamed to fit new theological landscapes. In Christian writings, she rarely appears by name, yet fragments of her story emerge in altered forms. Some medieval commentaries describe a nocturnal temptress or a winged woman who brings harm to infants. Echoes of Lilith's older attributes, repurposed in a Christian moral framework that cast her as a warning against lust and disobedience. In Islamic tradition, too, faint traces can be found. While Lilith herself is absent from the Quran, certain folklore and hadith collections speak of female jinn who resemble her in temperament and power, beings of the night, independent, and sometimes hostile to human households. In some regions, her traits were absorbed into local spirit lore, taking on Arabic names and forms. This migration across faiths was not accidental. Stories travel with people. Merchants, scholars, and migrants carried them from port to port, court to court. And each culture, meeting this shadowed figure at the edge of its own beliefs, reshaped her to reflect its fears and values. Lilith became less a single fixed identity and more a shifting silhouette, an archetype recognizable even when called by another name. Through these transformations, the core remained, a woman who would not bend, linked to the dangerous freedoms of the night. Her image might soften, harden, or vanish in official doctrine, yet she lingered in the margins, a quiet constant in the shared, interwoven storytelling of the medieval world. In the art of the Middle Ages, Lilith's presence is often subtle, almost secretive, a whispered image hidden among gilded saints and solemn angels. In some illuminated Bibles, she appears not as a central figure, but as a small, coiled detail. a pale woman entwined with a serpent near the base of the tree of knowledge, her gaze angled toward Eve. She is rarely named, and yet her form, the long hair, the serpentine tail, the slightly averted eyes, carries the unmistakable signature of an older story that artists could not quite let go. In wall frescoes, particularly those adorning remote chapels or cloisters, her image might hide in the shadows of the composition, blending into allegorical depictions of temptation or sin. A winged silhouette in the corner, or a dark-haired woman perched in a tree, is enough to hint at her presence without inviting theological scrutiny. The poetry of the era took similar liberties. Courtly poets and monastic writers occasionally evoked a night woman, neither angel nor demon, who tempts and warns in equal measure. She is sometimes painted as a muse of forbidden knowledge, other times as a cautionary phantom. These poetic Liliths are less explicit demons than embodiments of mystery, the type of figure who lingers in the reader's mind long after the last line has faded. This quiet concealment, the decision to place her not in the center but in the periphery, was itself a form of survival. By making her small, by dimming her colors, the artists and poets of the Middle Ages allowed Lilith to remain in the public eye without provoking the censors. She was a shadow at the edge of the frame, present in the shared imagination even when erased from the main text. The Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries brought a sweeping change to the intellectual climate of Europe. Across its great cities, from London to Paris, from Vienna to Amsterdam, philosophers, scientists, and reformers championed the principles of reason, evidence, and empirical inquiry. This was an age in which the candlelight of superstition was to be replaced by the steady lamp of rational thought. In this environment, figures like Lilith, woven from a fabric of folklore, scripture, and whispered tradition, no longer fit comfortably in the official narrative. Scholars began to strip away layers of myth from their histories, treating such beings as relics of an unrefined pre-scientific age. Clerics and theologians, eager to align their faith with Enlightenment ideals, either omitted Lilith entirely from sermons and writings or recast her as nothing more than a poetic metaphor. The change was most visible in published texts. Biblical commentaries that once lingered on the possibilities of night demons now glossed over or ignored those passages. The illuminated manuscripts of earlier centuries gave way to printed Bibles devoid of marginalia, devoid of the whispered figures at the edge of the page. Lilith, like so many supernatural beings, was quietly escorted out of the mainstream record. Yet erasure from official texts did not mean erasure from memory. While scholars wrote her out, rural households, far from the lecture halls and salons of Enlightenment Europe, still carried her name in song and story. She survived in lullabies, in whispered warnings told to children beside the hearth, and in the quiet, cyclical telling of local legends. Beyond the reach of Europe's academies and printing presses, Lilith's presence lingered in the lives of ordinary people. In small towns and remote villages, where the Enlightenment's emphasis on rationalism was a distant echo, the world still pulsed with a rhythm older than printed pages, a rhythm of oral tradition. Here, Lilith's story adapted to the needs and fears of the community. In some regions, she remained the nocturnal danger, the shadow to be kept at bay. Mothers would murmur protective charms before sleep. Fathers might carve protective symbols into door frames, and midwives carried knowledge of old talismans passed down through generations. But in other places, a curious reversal occurred. Lilith's fierce independence and untamed nature became a form of protection rather than a threat. In certain lullabies, she was invoked not as a predator, but as a guardian, a watchful figure who stood between children and the dangers of the night. These songs carried a tone less of warning and more of invitation, as though speaking to a wild but benevolent neighbor. Such reinterpretations reveal the flexibility of oral tradition. Without the rigid authority of printed scripture, stories could shift and soften, molded by the values and needs of the tellers. A feared demon in one village might be a nocturnal ally in another. By the end of the Enlightenment era, Lilith lived in two worlds, absent from the carefully reasoned histories of the intellectual elite, yet fully alive in the warm, flickering spaces of communal storytelling. These ember-like memories would smolder quietly, awaiting the next gust of cultural wind that would fan them into flame. In the 19th century, that gust would come, and Lilith would awaken with new power, clothed in the romanticism and mysticism of a changing world. The 19th century brought with it a profound cultural shift. After the rigid rationalism of the Enlightenment, the Romantic movement surged like a tide across Europe. Poets, painters, and philosophers turned away from cold logic, seeking instead the mysterious, the emotional, and the untamed. In this fertile ground, forgotten myths could bloom once more, and Lilith was among them. Writers in the Romantic era were fascinated by figures who defied convention, especially women who resisted the boundaries of their time. Lilith, with her deep roots in ancient mystery and her reputation as the first to walk away from Eden, embodied precisely the kind of untamed spirit Romanticism adored. In literature, she began to appear as a figure of haunting beauty. Dangerous, yes, but also tragically misunderstood. The occult revival of the same century only deepened her allure. Secret societies and mystics combed through ancient texts in search of hidden wisdom, and Lilith's name surfaced in esoteric circles as a keeper of forbidden knowledge. She became not only a character from Scripture's margins, but a cipher for something deeper, the primal feminine, the eternal outsider. This was also the century in which women's roles were beginning to change, albeit slowly. The fascination with Lilith's independence resonated in an age when debates about women's rights were gaining momentum. She was no longer just a figure of fear. In some circles, she became an icon of defiance, a silent rebellion painted in ink and pigment. This fascination would find its most vivid expression in the arts, where the pre-Raphaelites and symbolists transformed Lilith into a muse of almost hypnotic presence. If the Romantic poets rekindled Lilith's story in words, the painters of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and the symbolist movement brought her vividly to life on canvas. The pre-Raphaelites, with their meticulous attention to detail and love for medieval and mythical subjects, found in Lilith an ideal subject, a woman whose beauty was inseparable from danger. In John Collier's Lilith and Dante Gabriel Rossetti's haunting portraits, she is depicted with luminous skin, cascading hair, and an almost hypnotic calm. These were not the snarling demons of medieval imagination, but women whose very stillness carried an unspoken power. Symbolist painters, too, embraced her image, but with an added layer of dreamlike mystery. In their hands, Lilith became a figure suspended between the human and the supernatural. Her surroundings filled with coded imagery, coiled serpents hinting at Eden, mirrors reflecting truths unseen, and shadowed corners suggesting secrets not meant for all eyes. These details were not accidental. Many artists embedded subtle symbols to communicate with those who knew the legend's deeper meanings. A serpent curling through Lilith's hair might speak to her defiance in Eden. A mirror might symbolize self-knowledge, independence, or vanity, depending on the viewer's perspective. For the casual observer, these were simply beautiful, intriguing paintings. For the initiated, they were acts of quiet rebellion, immortalizing the woman who would not bow in brushstrokes and oil. Through art, Lilith's identity shifted yet again. She was no longer just a figure of folklore or a theological curiosity. She became an emblem of personal freedom, sensuality, and the power of self-definition. As the 20th century unfolded, Lilith stepped beyond the realm of art galleries and folklore archives, finding a new life in the emerging science of the mind. The early pioneers of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung among them, were captivated by symbols, archetypes, and the hidden forces shaping human behavior. In Lilith, they recognized a potent figure for exploring two of their central preoccupations, desire and the shadow self. For Freud, whose theories often returned to the roots of sexuality and repression, Lilith could be read as the embodiment of untamed eroticism, a figure who refused to be subjugated, whose defiance of Adam mirrored a deeper human resistance to imposed moral boundaries. She became, in his framework, a vessel for both the allure and the anxiety that the feminine could evoke. Jung's interpretation reached into the collective unconscious, the vast reservoir of shared human imagery and myth. To him, Lilith was not just a dangerous seductress, but an archetype, a manifestation of the dark feminine, representing the aspects of the psyche that are repressed or denied. She was the shadow to Eve's light, a counterpart necessary for wholeness. Confronting Lilith in Jungian terms was part of the essential work of integrating one's full self. This psychological lens transformed Lilith from an external threat into an internal presence. No longer just a figure lurking in mythic night, she became a symbol of the human mind's unacknowledged forces, beautiful, dangerous, and deeply personal. By the mid-20th century, Lilith had begun to step fully into the vibrant, shifting stage of popular culture. No longer confined to the pages of scholarly texts or the canvases of symbolist painters, she found herself in songs, novels, comics, and, eventually, on television screens. Here, the ancient figure became endlessly adaptable, reshaped to fit the needs of each new storyteller and audience. In music, she appeared as a muse of rebellion, her name woven into lyrics that celebrated independence or warned of dangerous allure. Novelists explored her through speculative fiction and magical realism, placing her in contemporary settings or imagining her return to a modern world unprepared for her defiance. Comic book creators, especially in the latter half of the century, took even bolder steps, reimagining Lilith not as a villain, but as a heroine. In some storylines, she stood as a protector of the marginalized, her supernatural strength turned toward defending those without power. On television and in film, Lilith's presence ranged from subtle references to full reinterpretations. She appeared as enigmatic figures in horror anthologies, as supernatural beings in urban fantasy, and as symbolic characters in psychological dramas. Each adaptation, whether respectful to her ancient roots or wildly divergent, added another layer to her evolving cultural identity. This reinvention in popular media blurred the lines between the feared and the admired. Audiences could now encounter Lilith not only as the dark temptress of myth, but also as a complex character, one capable of tenderness, loyalty, and even heroism. In the 1960s and 70s, as second-wave feminism surged through the United States and beyond, Lilith emerged from the margins of myth to become a rallying figure. For generations, she had been cast as the dangerous woman, the disobedient wife, the temptress, the demon. But for feminist thinkers, these very traits became the source of her power. Writers and activists reframed Lilith not as a threat to be feared, but as a symbol of autonomy, the first woman to refuse submission. Her refusal to bow to Adam was reinterpreted as a conscious act of self-determination, a rejection of a hierarchy that placed her beneath another human being. To these new voices, Lilith was not a cautionary tale, but a role model, a reminder that walking away from an unjust situation could be an act of courage. Lilith's name began appearing in feminist publications, poetry, and art. She was invoked at rallies and written into manifestos, not as a figure from dusty religious margins, but as a living emblem of resistance. In her, women could see an ancient predecessor who had already fought and walked away from the very struggles they were confronting. As the feminist movement evolved, a quieter but equally powerful transformation took place within Jewish religious life. In the 1970s and 80s, Jewish feminist theologians began asking why certain stories had been excluded from sacred texts, and why figures like Lilith, so prominent in folklore, were absent from the official liturgy. Some saw Lilith's erasure as symbolic of how women's voices had been minimized in Jewish tradition. The response was not simply academic, it was ritual. New prayers, blessings, and ceremonies were created to welcome Lilith back into the spiritual conversation. In some communities, she was no longer the lurking danger at the edge of the cradle, but an honored guest at the table, invited to share in the protection of children rather than be feared as their enemy. At feminist Cedars, participants spoke her name aloud as part of the narrative of liberation, linking her defiance to the larger story of freedom in Jewish history. In some modern rituals, a seat was left for Lilith beside Elijah's, a symbolic act of returning her to the community she had been cast out from. This was not a wholesale acceptance of every part of her legend. Rather, it was a selective reclamation, drawing on the aspects of Lilith that spoke to independence, equality, and female strength, while discarding the layers of demonization added over centuries. With the rise of the internet in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Lilith escaped the confines of books, religious commentary, and even feminist gatherings. She became a living presence in online culture, reshaped and reinterpreted by millions of users across platforms. In meme culture, she appeared as both joke and icon, sometimes a sly reference in feminist humor, other times a powerful digital portrait shared across social media. Fan artists drew her in countless forms: the defiant first woman, the shadowy night spirit, the sci-fi warrior queen. Online forums dedicated to mysticism, occultism, and folklore traded interpretations of her story, debating whether she was an ancient demon, a misunderstood goddess, or a human archetype that could adapt to any era. Her name became a search term, a hashtag, and an avatar. Across the fragmented worlds of blogs, fandom spaces, and discussion boards, Lilith was no longer dependent on a single tradition for her survival. She belonged to everyone who chose to use her image or name. In the parallel world of modern spiritual revival, Lilith found new sanctuaries within neo-paganism and Wicca. Practitioners, drawn to deities and archetypes that embodied autonomy and defiance, began incorporating her into seasonal rituals, spell work, and meditations. In these contexts, Lilith was often invoked not as a figure of danger, but as a guide to personal empowerment, the one who walks away from imposed order to seek her own path. Some Wiccan covens honor her during moonlit rites, linking her to the cycles of the moon and the primal feminine. In neo-pagan festivals, she might be represented in altar statues, surrounded by symbols of owls, serpents, and the night sky. Here, she became part of a shared pantheon, a free spirit standing alongside goddesses like Hecate or Isis. In the last decade, a curious new expression of her myth emerged: AI feminism. Online communities exploring the intersection of gender and technology began to use Lilith as a symbolic counterpoint to the male-coded imagery of much modern tech. For them, she was the archetype of female-coded intelligence, powerful, self-directed, and resistant to control. In digital art, she appears merged with circuit patterns or gazing out from behind glowing screens, a presence that suggests both timeless myth and futuristic possibility. Across centuries and continents, Lilith has been reimagined, demonized, celebrated, and reinterpreted, yet certain qualities remain constant. She is the archetype of rebellion, the refusal to submit to imposed hierarchies, the embodiment of self-creation. Whether as a Mesopotamian spirit, Adam's equal, a medieval demon, a muse for painters, or a symbol for digital age feminism, her story has always carried the same undercurrent: the right to define oneself. In myth, she walks away from Eden rather than live in subjugation. In folklore, she navigates the shadows of fear and desire. In art, she confronts the viewer with her gaze. And in modern reinterpretations, she stands at the edge of both the physical and virtual worlds, still untamed. Her adaptability is her survival. The archetype thrives because it can be remade by each generation to answer its own questions about autonomy, identity, and the balance between freedom and belonging. Imagine once again the quiet, dim light of an ancient library. On a wooden table rests the same centuries-old Bible we encountered at the very beginning. Its pages are worn thin, the ink softened by time. As you turn the leaf, your eye catches that same small note, handwritten in the margin in faded Hebrew. Lilith was here. In the main text, she does not appear. Official history left her absent, erased, omitted, forgotten. Yet like the faint scent of ink that still lingers on the page, her presence endures. She has survived, not in the polished lines of sanctioned scripture, but in the margins, in whispered stories, in folk songs, in paintings, in digital art, and in the minds of those who find meaning in her defiance. The note is more than a name. It is a reminder that some stories live precisely because they cannot be contained. They slip between the lines, traveling through time and across cultures, transforming to meet each new age. Lilith's journey from the myths of Mesopotamia to the algorithms of the internet is a testament to the resilience of an archetype, a figure who has been called a demon, a goddess, a rebel, and a protector. And so, even if the official page insists she was never there, the truth is written just at the edge. She is here and has always been. And with that, our journey with Lilith draws to a close. From the shadows of ancient Mesopotamia to the glow of a modern screen, her story reminds us that what is written in the margins can outlast what is printed in the center. If you enjoyed this exploration, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next untold history we uncover together.